Everyone, and welcome to my office. I am just going to give you a brief look at what you're reading in Margaret Fell, and perhaps you'd like to know why I have you read this anyway. So in Women Speaking Justified, I will give you a justification for having you read it. Margaret Fell, of course, one of the founders of the Quaker religion, particularly the Circle of Friends within the Quaker belief system and practices. She was married to a judge, a circuit judge, and back then circuit judges literally traveled a circuit in order to perform their judgment duties. And she was left home alone a lot, and this home was her father's home. Back then, women couldn't have property themselves, so she married so that she could inherit and keep the land and the estate. Now, we don't really know the complete timing on this, but she started having a preacher of what became the Quaker vision coming and speaking at her house. That preacher's last name was Fox, and she would have him visit, and he would preach to her and her friends, and this was mostly women, and they would do it in her estate. So that's how she ended up meeting her second husband. Now, her first husband died because obviously divorce isn't a thing back then, especially, but in the religion, I don't believe that that's allowed. Anyway, she married Fox, and she was his wife, and both of them ended up going to jail. Her for a very short period of time, him for a lot longer. She went to jail because she refused to swear on the Bible. And that is something that Quakers do not do. They do not swear on the name of God or on the Bible. His offense was a little bit bigger than that. I think it was because he was preaching something that the social system did not like. And so his writings were considered radical. Now, she wasn't in jail that long, but she wrote just as he did. But she wrote this piece that has survived called Women Speaking Justified. And there is actually a subtitle, which is In the Church. And I think a lot of people forget that. They think that it's Women Speaking Justified just anywhere, and that somehow she's this huge feminist. But that's not really where this comes from. Where it comes from is where her argument comes from. So let's talk specifically about this work, and there's a few reasons why I have you read it. In this work, she defines why women or how women are not allowed to speak in the church. And back then, literally, if you were a female and you went into the church, you weren't allowed to speak. You had to put something on your head, and you had to be silent. And then also, yes, they didn't do any public speaking, obviously, either. That was considered dirty, and it was for men only. But she's talking specifically about speaking in the church. And the reason why she's talking about specifically in the church is because she wants women to be able to preach the Bible. And so what evidence does she use? She uses the Bible. Now, a lot of people might say, well, the Bible isn't evidence, but in this context, it definitely is. That is a debate for another day. But in the case of her argument, it's the most appropriate evidence you can have, because in it, she makes the argument that God wanted women to speak. How does she say God wanted women to speak? Well, first of all, you have the Virgin Mary, and she had Jesus with God. So there was no man involved in that. I don't know if she directly says that in the edited version that you have, but she's not making that as a feminist argument of we don't need men. She's making that in an argument that women preaching in the church would be considered okay by God, basically. She also talks about how the first people to announce that Christ had risen from the dead were 3 women. Okay, so he may have had the 12 apostles. Jesus, he may have preached to mostly men, but women were the ones who gave sort of the defining news of Jesus's death and resurrection. So during the time that Jesus is being crucified, we know that he had to carry his cross a long way, as did all people who got crucified back then. And women were with him. They walked with him. His mother, Mary, Mary Magdalene, and Veronica are at least three of the women that I know of that went with him. And then there were some men as well, but the women would wipe his face, and the women would do what they could to encourage him along his way and pray for him. And I can't imagine what that would be like if my son had to go and get crucified and I had to walk with him on that journey. But that is where Margaret Fell, from those stories that we are told from the Bible, says that women should be allowed to speak. Now, why do I have you read this? A couple of reasons. Number one, it's a really good example of using the correct evidence in the context for which you're writing and for the purpose that you're writing. Number two, it 100% is all about considering the audience, okay? And when you consider the audience, because if you're not a Christian or you don't have any faith in the Bible or the Bible of the time or God, even if you don't believe in any of that, that's because that's okay, because she's not speaking to you. So she's not trying to persuade anyone outside of those who already have a common belief. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that sometimes we have to persuade within a very small context or a very small segment of an audience in order to persuade bigger changes. So if she could persuade people that women should speak in the church, and she started with women, by the way, then she could also make that change at the level of the church, so that the Quaker church would then respect women enough, in her terms, to speak in church and to preach in church. And so it's a very limited scope of persuasion, but it's a very, very clearly dictated, persuasive message to those in the church. And it's well written. And her evidence comes from probably the only place it needs to come from in terms of what she's trying to do. So that's what this is an example of. I hope that you got something out of reading it, and that'll be on the next exam, so you don't need to worry about it for this exam, which I'm going to remind you is due Monday, this coming Monday, September 30th by 11:59 p.m. So make sure that you do get a chance to go in and make sure you can open it and take the exam at your leisure, of course. And if there's any other questions, comments, or concerns about that, as always, it's the weekend, sort of. I will obviously be checking email tomorrow, but if there's an issue over the weekend, please text me, because I likely will not be checking email often enough to really be of help to you. Okay, everybody, good luck. Talk to you soon.